Hello, and welcome to the Mental Health and series. Today, we're joined by special guest Ana Dolores, who is at the Fuller Theological Seminary here in Pasadena. She's pursuing her clinical psychology doctorate right now at Fuller, and she's here to share with us the cross between mental health and first generation experiences. Welcome, my friend Ana.
Hello, Krista. Thank you so much for having me here. I am excited to have this conversation with you and just talk about, especially this month of mental health.
Yes. So tell us before we even begin, just kind of generally, what does it mean to be first generation? And in fact, I learned last year or 2 years ago at Fuller, there was an Asian American panel or something. I heard the term
Mhm.
1.5 generation that year, and that was something that I learned about. So can you tell us about that?
So basically, just the term that they have is that first generation is are immigrants who were born outside the country and then immigrated as an adult to the US. And then 1.5 actually, like sociologists have coined this term to describe people who immigrated to a new country before or during their early teens. So then anybody who arrived at the US before teens, they will be called 1.5. So then now we have second generations. So second generations will be now the ones that were born here in the US, but their parents were born somewhere else in another country. Yeah.
Gotcha. So tell us about your dissertation project, which works with these populations.
Yes, okay, that's a good one to talk about. So I consider myself a 1.5 generation because I've arrived before when I was 12 to the States, just learning about my parents' background and then that they were born in Mexico and now we migrated, and then also having nieces and nephews who were born here in the States. I kind of have this sense of like one generation, 1.5 and 2. Those are my, I love talking about that topic of like just understanding our experiences. And so for my dissertation, I actually decided to kind of focus on just Mexican Americans and their experiences here in the United States as they are working towards their understanding the ethnic identity, and then also how does this play a part as they are young adults? So for me, my special population who I want to work with is like young adults who are in their 20s and then they're trying to navigate and understand their ethnic identity.
So May is also AAPI month. And as a Filipino American, this is interesting to talk about right now as well, because like you're saying, there is kind of a separation in experiences, which perhaps you wouldn't otherwise know unless you're studying it. Growing up with an immigrant mom, there were so many things that are associated with being first generation and me being second generation that I didn't even really recognize until I moved to LA and had other friends
Mm,
with immigrant parents also. I think it is interesting to like research this population, especially because we're a pretty new country. We're only a couple hundred years old. So this is kind of a new thing, at least for us here in the States. So
mhm.
tell us about what it means for you, the importance of this dissertation, and maybe for you, maybe I'm putting words in your mouth here, but bridging the gap between that young adult and their parent.
Yes, I think everything comes from experience and what I have experienced. That's the main thing that kind of drew me to this dissertation topic. And then also like I believe that is not only my dissertation, but then also I'm trying to do this everywhere I go. Like for example, the practicum sites where I do my internship or things like that. I try to go into these places where there is this population that I want to work with. Especially like I said, in my house. I've seen that. Like I think at the beginning when I arrived here, I was just trying to understand where I am, how am I gonna navigate this? What does it mean to go to school and not know the rules of like society? What am I supposed to do, for example, with friends? And it's way different than what I experienced when I was in Mexico. So I feel like during my time, I was trying to understand that, right? And so then as I grew older, as I tried to like question about like who I am, where I'm coming from, and especially like my Catholic identity and how that fits into who I am, I started to like become more aware of like that of myself, like finding myself and like, wow, I didn't know this play a part in my life. For example, when let's say I was in high school, I was invited to go to the dances at high school. It was normal for my peers to be like, oh, this is so exciting. We're going to get a dress. My parents are on it. They're taking pictures. But for me, my parents actually, they were like, no, you're not going. You're not going because we don't know who these people are. We don't speak the language. We don't know your professors, your school. So then I was not allowed to go, and so then all of that for me, it was just so disorienting. And I was like, why? How is it that my friends could go and I can't go? Is
Mm.
it because like my parents are too strict, or what was it? Little by little, I was able to, as I grew older and as I started like also researching and learning about myself and through the dissertation project, I was able to see that when it comes to a first generation and then it's at 1.5 even or second generation, there is a language that each of us were speaking. Let's say the parent is speaking Spanish and then the child is speaking English, and they try to communicate. The parent don't understand English and the child might not know Spanish as well. So then there's like this discrepancy when they're trying to communicate. And maybe just to give an example, this could be like food wise. This could be like so simple as food, and that's what I mean when I'm talking about language or what different languages. So, for example, the kid is introduced to different food at school, and then at home they eat a different food, and so then now it's like maybe they like this food here at school, and maybe they're like, oh, mommy, I don't like this, and then your mom is like, wait, why are you not liking my food? So then now the mom is like, oh, kind of maybe offended, or like maybe like, come on, you gotta eat my food. But then it's like in that sense of like the language, it's just that there's no the parent has a different experience and the child has a different experience, and then there's no language there. So for me, I would like to like kind of have like a built a bridge in order to understand little concepts like this.
Sure. And I think what I'm hearing is when you're saying language, it's not just Spanish and English. It's
Hmm.
the language of experience. And there's such a discrepancy perhaps between the first generation and for me, I'm a second generation. There's a discrepancy in understanding one another's life experience because that's where the first gap is. It's the biggest gap probably. Like maybe for you as a 1.5 generation, like your children might not experience that big of a gap between in life
Hmm.
experience, maybe a little in like parenting your experience with your parents, but not such a wide gap between countries, that my mom's
Right.
upbringing is completely different than my upbringing. And so
Mhm.
you're talking about language, but you're not talking about English and Spanish. You're talking about the language of experience and how, like you said, like food and these cultural staples, music.
Mhm.
I remember the first time my mom showed me a traditional Filipino outfit. I said, that's weird. And like to her, like, this is
Mhm.
beautiful. This is my culture.
Right,
And,
right. Oh.
now I love the Filipinanas, the big sleeves and stuff. But I
Mhm.
gained that later. Yeah, you're talking about the
Mhm.
language of experience. Tell me, how are you implementing that, or how are you trying to bridge that gap through? Yeah, you're going to be a therapist, right? This isn't like you're not a research, like Cameron is more
Mhm.
research based, right? So,
Yeah, so then because what I'm gaining is my PsyD, doctoral in clinical psychology. And so this one is the emphasis is more on the clinical experience. So my main focus will be therapy, therapy and assessment. And then we can also do research, but kind of that's like
sure.
the outside. That's an extra thing that we can do. So for me, I think I chose clinical psychology PsyD instead of the PhD, which is like doctoral in philosophy of clinical psychology, just to understand a little bit more of the difference. And so I decided to do clinical because I would like to be in the room with, right now I'm saying young adults because I love to work with young adults, but with any client. My main focus is to be in the room with a an individual and just be able to sit with them in their experience and kind of navigate, parse out through all these internal struggles that they might be facing. Sometimes as they come to us in the therapy room, most of them, they know that there's something going on, and but then at the same time they're not really aware of like where is that coming from. And so as we talk and as we explore, they're able to find language to the experience. They're able to say, like, oh my gosh, it's because of this,
Mm-hmm.
then this happened. And then from there, they're able to make a decision of what to do next.
So tell me, you mentioned this internal world both just now and in our pre-interview. So can you give us kind of the differentiation between, and specific to this population that you're talking about, of,
Mm,
and maybe examples of internal experiences and external experiences and how they affect your perception of your relationships of the world? Dive into that however you want.
it's fascinating to know. And I feel like as I'm learning, as I'm in grad school, I'm also learning about these concepts, and I'm also learning about what does this mean. The way that it clicked for me is that I was in class and we're talking about perceptions. And my professor, he showed us a pen. Like he just put a pen up for us to see. And then he's all like, okay, guys, like, here, this is a pen. And then he's all like, I am sure all of you guys have a different experience of a pen, of this pen. Meaning that when we see this pen, something pops up in our mind that reminds us of like when was the first time that we used a pen, or an experience with somebody about a pen, right? And so for me, that kind of opened my mind to like, wow, that is so true. I carry my own experience, and my own experience is unique to me, that nobody else knows about it unless I communicate it with them. That's the internal world that each of us, as we walk in this world, we are carrying an internal world that we have inside of us that informs our decisions, that informs how we behave, that informs our emotions. All of it is happening in our minds, all of it is happening within ourselves. And sometimes when our mind, so then that's when mental health comes in, the mental illnesses. There's times where like our minds is just so convoluted. For example, anxiety, like worrying or rumination, all of that is going on. So that's within ourselves. We interact with other people, but at the same time we are interacting with within ourselves, with our whole bodies and our own experiences.
I'm thinking of like when mental health and wellness, and someone who's like holistically well has like a good
Mm,
measuring stick between their external world and their internal world. And there are things that happen externally that still maybe like affect me, in a normal human way, but it's not affecting my sense of identity, maybe. And when you have like that
mm-hmm,
strong sense of your own interior experiences, like, oh, that can be that person's perception of me, but that's not who I am. And
mm-hmm,
so like
mm-hmm,
having a good balance between both, like not to like shun away any external experiences, but also not to let all the external affect me internally.
mm-hmm.
So I love that differentiation, and that like we are all kind of a little bit of an infinity, I guess, to use
Oh,
this phrase from a John Green book, I believe. This
mm-hmm.
that we all have our own little infinity going on. When you're talking about the pin, it actually reminded me of a book. I think it's right here on my shelf, actually. Introduction to
Yeah.
Phenomenology. I don't know if you've ever read a lot of
Mm,
phenomenology, but
mm.
if I'm correct, I don't know if the exact definition, but I think phenomenology is like the philosophy of human experience, which is super cool. One of my, it's like chapter one or something in this book is so crazy. It's like literally a wild title. I had to look it up right now. It's called
Mm.
Perception of a Cube as a Paradigm of Conscious Experience, which basically
Perception.
means means that there's infinite ways to look at a cube. Like you could look at it straight on, you could look at it at an angle. If we're sitting around a circle looking at the cube, we're all looking at the same cube from a different way. And
Mm-hmm.
it's a very interesting concept, and he illustrates like philosophically something profound that I
Yeah.
can't do right now. But
Right now, when you said that, it reminded me of like also the concept of an elephant. Like people talk about an elephant too. Like there's people around the elephant, and some people might see one part of the elephant, and the other people will see the other side. It's like this concept of perception. I am fascinated with perceptions.
yeah, so how does that play into like sometimes a bit of a gap between parent-child relationships? How do you manage that much of a gap in experience? They're your client, they make choices based on what they discover in sessions with you, and even like starting to integrate the faith into it.
Oh, that's such a good question. How do we do that? And I think that's something that I'm still trying to understand. I'm still trying to understand. But as you share about what about integration? What about my Catholic faith? How does that play a part? One thing that I'm thinking about is that it informs my way of viewing other people, is that we are created in the image and likeness of God. And so for me, I feel like that's my foundation as I'm trying to understand each individual and how each individual deserves dignity and is meant to love and be loved. You know how John Paul II talks about that. When I'm with a client in therapy room, what I do first is just kind of just be there with them and stay in their experiences and in their suffering. And then once they are able to kind of make sense of what's going on, they're able to understand more about themselves. And once they are able to understand and get more language about their experience, they're able to express that. And so once they're able to express that, the other person, for example, let's say now we're talking about a first generation parent and then a second generation son or daughter, let's say the son, as he's getting to know more about himself, his experiences, now he's able to communicate that to his parents. And hopefully the parent also can be able to understand where the son is coming from, and then it creates that dialogue that hopefully that can help with the healing process of like in understanding each other, kind of thinking about like that perception that we're talking about, like is like for example the son or the daughter kind of like, this is how I see the pen,
Hmm.
and this is how what comes to mind when I think about a pen, and so talking to the parent about it. And so hope that that conversation is reciprocated.
Even in my own like therapeutic experiences with my therapists, I know that most of the healing comes from not any kind of practice, or like there's so many different modalities, but it's like 90% or more probably that's just from the unbiased kind of listening aspect of the
Mm-hmm,
therapeutic room. So that's
mm-hmm.
huge. Um,
Totally right.
and there's definitely a difference. Like I've had like many shades of Catholic therapists, but the
Mm-hmm.
ones that I kind of vibe with the most are the ones who are able to integrate like forgiveness and hope
Mm,
into it, because they know I'm a therapist shouldn't be like pushing it on you or forcing it on you. In my case with my therapist, they knew I was a practicing Catholic. They understood
mm,
terminology that I would use, like discernment and things like that. So
mm,
they understood that element of yeah, my identity and who I am. And so
mm,
because of that, they would encourage forgiveness. They would encourage the virtue of hope, and the
mm.
fact that a therapist has the ability to do that. Like it changed the game for me, I think, in therapy. Can you talk a little bit about the maybe stigma that it's selfish to do that? It's selfish to go to therapy, particularly because Mexican culture, probably Filipino too, very interdependent cultures. We're very like do
Mm,
the good for the family, and making choices in life that's beneficial for the whole family. So therapy might be kind of like this great friction and tension, and seems selfish. What would you say about
mm.
that?
That's a tough one. Like, yeah, like you're saying, we we live in relationship. And even like as we're thinking about our Catholic faith too, the greatest commandment that we have, love thy neighbor as yourself. Seeing that like, okay, I need to love others. Also like, oh, but then the first part is love yourself as as well as your neighbor, you know? I can give you an example of like somebody who I work with and how this person was very, very distressed. And the first call that I had in the phone, this person was saying how I even feel guilty talking to you right now because this is a precious time that I can be either working or studying or being with my kids. And
Wow.
I just, yes, like so much shame. And so then as we process that, at the end of that session, this person was able to say, I didn't know how much I needed that. I didn't know how much I just needed to have somebody to listen to me. After that, they were able to say, okay, I'll come back next session as we explore and talk more about the experiences and the internal struggle of like, what does it mean to be a mom, but in working, but then also being a student? Like, what does that mean? You know, this person eventually was able to see that I need to take care of myself in order to help others, you know? And so eventually she was able to realize that I need to love myself first. And the way I can love myself right now is I'm going through this experience and I need help. And they were able to go through this. And from there, she was able to give to others,
Yeah,
you
it
know?
makes me think of like just like physical health. Like if you imagine breaking your arm and saying, "Yeah, it's selfish for me to
Mm-hmm,
go get my arm fixed." Because,
mm-hmm.
yeah, I mean, I have so much other things that I can do. I have kids to take care of, or I need to do a good job at my work. And
It's a
that is
great
all true.
analogy. Yeah.
But if you're willing to take care of a broken bone or some other internal organ, yeah, mental health is just part of that. And there is still
Yeah.
stigma around that. Yeah, I do think it's important to receive and then be able to
Mm,
give from that. And I think a lot of people might feel like they aren't worth that time for
yeah.
themselves. Or it's just really hard. I get that it's really hard to take care of
Yeah.
yourself in those ways. Or if you've never experienced it, like how helpful it can be. They can give you language for things like, I mean, I have a master's in psychology, and my therapist, after my graduation, was still telling me, like, oh, that sounds like a stopper voice, or like that sounds like a driver voice, or like you were saying even earlier about the internal world, like our internal world
Mm-hmm.
is very rich. Like you said, it informs things, it
Mm-hmm.
informs the way you make decisions, it informs your
Mm-hmm.
relationships, and it's doing that whether you know it or not. So it's better to just
Yes.
know it.
Oh, I love that. Even though we're not aware, is doing that. Oh, it's fascinating how sometimes we're not aware of that. We're not aware that we do have an internal world.
Yeah, but I
Mm-hmm.
think too, like because we're in a noisier world, it is harder probably to tap into that. I love silent retreats. If you've never been on a silent retreat, when you go on a silent retreat,
Mm-hmm.
it's a really stark reality change. It's like, oh my gosh, no
Yes.
phone, no noise, no music, no nothing, no street noise. Sometimes if you're like in the mountain, or Jerome likes to go to the desert. I think I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I think being able to tap into that internal world is probably really important for people, even
Mm-hmm.
extroverts like me. I'm so extroverted. And as we kind of talked about in the pre-interview, and being able to regulate that, because external things can kind of like break that boundary or that barrier sometimes that we might maybe should have between us and the exterior. What do you like what would you say of someone who's like trying to make sense, maybe even just in your population, trying to make
Mm-hmm.
sense of that separation of the exterior and the interior, and being able to regulate that when something external is like a microaggression or some sort of
Mm-hmm.
discrimination? Like what would you say
Yeah.
to
Oh,
someone trying to regulate that?
that one is a very real question, and it's like it brings real emotions, meaning that, for example, in microaggression or discrimination, that does affect you. That does like
Hmm.
break you in a way because it's kind of talking about your persona of who you are,
Mm-hmm.
and then also like it saddens that like kind of thinking about the assumptions that is made out of that. I have struggled with that. Like
Yeah.
there's so many moments where sometimes I get really upset. This person is not looking at me with the eyes of God, let's say,
Yeah.
or like it's not like taking in consideration like who I am as a person. It's just assuming
Mm-hmm.
that because the way I look or because the way I speak, then they're like, oh, then you must do this or you must like this. And sometimes that's very sad. So in my own experience, it does affect me, and it takes me a while to just kind of come to terms of like what's going on, kind of understand the things that I do is like always go back to God.
Mm.
I think my thing is like going back to prayer and then kind of going back to like Jesus and telling him like being real with him.
Yeah.
It's like, hey God, like this is what happened to me. And then I'm very upset because that's not fair. And
Mm.
I'm not being seen as you created me. You said that I'm like your daughter and your image and likeness. And why is it that I'm being treated this way? So I think for me, it's like always going back to being real with God and
Mm.
just telling him how I feel. And then eventually, like that gives me peace. God kind of responding to me and saying, like, you are my daughter and you are worth more than what you can imagine. And I die for you.
Mm.
I die in the cross for you. And you are loved. And I think once I'm able to process that and think through it, and then also like kind of my own therapy and talking to my own friends or my family members, that helps me. And just realizing that I'm not alone. When I talk about my experiences, like others also talk to me about their experiences. And then we kind of share this together.
Thank you for sharing that very vulnerable experience with us.
Mm,
That was very beautiful. And it brought to mind an experience too that
mm,
of a bit of a microaggression. Back when I was a barista, I experienced someone was mumbling under their breath their coffee order and I couldn't hear them. So I was just like, "Can you repeat that?" And
mm,
and they kind of like leaned forward in kind of a demeaning way and they were like, "Tall caramel latte" or whatever. And
mm,
and I was just like, "I just couldn't hear you. You just need to speak up." And
mm,
and I've had other people like interrogate me and they're like, "Yeah, I used to be a profiler and you don't fit the usual type or something." And are your parents
yeah.
immigrants? Are they naturalized? Were you born
Mm,
here? And like really just asking me these very private questions. Like you don't have the right to
mm,
to ask me this. Yeah, those experiences of yeah, I had never felt so dehumanized, I guess. Like it is a
mm,
very
mm,
dehumanizing kind of feeling to be like to be different and then treated differently because of it. And I remember I had a colleague, like you said, like being with others really helps. I had a
mm,
colleague
mhm,
and she was black and she saw that I took the order or like finished up the line and then went back to
mm,
the back room and then cried. And
mm.
she came and checked on me after she made all the drinks and she was like, "Hey, are you okay?" And I was like, "No, I'm really not." And she said,
Yeah.
they're always going to treat us like this. Just don't pay any attention to them. They're just always going to act like that, but you don't have to act like that. And it almost made me more sad. I was like, you've experienced this probably way more than I have, and it made me sad that she even said it like that. That oh, they're always going to treat us like this. Yeah, just like this experience of like wrestling with my identity or worth. And it's
Mhm,
not something that I think some people understand because they haven't experienced it. So it is always like refreshing to know someone who does and like not only to
mhm.
share it with other people who have experienced it,
Right,
but
right,
like in a
right.
therapeutic room, in a therapeutic setting, to have someone say, yeah, yeah, that was maltreatment and you're not being seen with the eyes of God. And so the antidote to that to me is to be seen with the eyes of God and to be seen
Mm,
as beautiful and lovely and worthy. And the thing that makes you different is the thing that makes you beautiful. And you shouldn't be
yeah.
treated different. You should be still respected and dignified. Yeah, the therapeutic setting is really helpful, but just good friends.
Mm,
Just being
yes.
seen,
Oh,
just
yes.
being seen, it can be very therapeutic too. So,
And even in the articles that I have been reading about like just the experiences of like Mexican Americans and things that they, go through. And for me, reading their experiences, like sometimes the researchers will include quotes of what they say, right? When I read those things, I'm just like, wow, it's not only I who experiences this, there's other people. For
Mm-hmm.
example, an article I was reading about, there was about women who are in leadership and who are Mexican Americans, and they're working in the education system. So they did a study with them just to see their experiences in the education system and how they're being treated, right? And so I guess one woman was saying how, and unfortunately, she says that she has to really dress up whenever she's in the workplace, because whenever they see her, they're not gonna think like, "Oh, are you the janitor?" or something, you know?
Oh, wow.
And so these are, yeah, strong experiences that they go through, and they have their doctoral degree and they're doing all these things, but sometimes people will confuse him with the janitor. And then they kind of talk about how they feel like, wow, what else do I need to do in order to be seen as the leader?
If this is not an experience that you've had, thank God for that. First of all, that you haven't like just happened to
Mm-hmm.
look a certain way and be associated with a certain type of job. I know some people who might ask, like, well, what do you do about that? Like, what are we going to do next? And obviously, there's the therapeutic practice that you're doing. I think one thing that I would say to someone who's asking about what can be done, being empathetic, being empathetic to other people's experiences is a huge thing that can be done. That if it's not something you experience, like I'm thankful for that for you because like I said, at least the one that I just shared, it was a very dehumanizing experience. You don't have to share the experience with me to like show a little bit of empathy and to understand people. And so to me, the thing that needs to be done is to not make assumptions.
Mm-hmm.
Don't make
Yeah.
assumptions about someone based on how they look. For me, it's like, okay, I'm very Cajun, but I do not look very Cajun. And,
Mm-hmm.
my palate is very Cajun. I even have little turns of phrases that are very Cajun. And so people expect me to be sounding a certain way because I look Filipino when I'm in Louisiana. And then when I'm here, people speak to me in Tagalog because I am Filipino.
Mm-hmm.
And then I have to say, no, ma'am, I can't understand you. I'm so sorry. And then when I say I'm from Louisiana, they expect me to sound a different way. And they're like, well, you don't sound like you're from Louisiana. And I don't think people are ill-tempered about it or they don't mean anything malicious with those questions or those statements.
Mm-hmm.
But it is just
Mm-hmm.
interesting. Like, okay, you expect me to look like, because I look like this,
Yeah.
that I have to sound like that. And then it's like the
Mm-hmm.
opposite being here in LA. I just think empathy is always needed and important.
And that's a question that we are going to be asking continuously, you know? Yeah, I do not have an answer. Like, what can we do about it? I said like the empathy, and that's something that I'm still wrestling with,
Yeah, no, me too. And that's why I mean, I know that's something that certain people in my life would ask, like, well, what do you do about it? You can't just share
Mm,
something like that. It's not, so for some people, it's not enough to hear people's experiences. They want to hear an actionable
mhm.
item. And
Right, right.
and which is fine. That's how some people's brain works. And I think for me, be empathetic, keep listening and keep learning because there's always something that we can learn from someone who's different than us. In my case, I feel like I had to understand my mom in a way that I
Mm-hmm.
wasn't able to probably until I was having, like I said, other friends who had immigrant parents. Being
Mm-hmm.
open to learning and listening and hopefully that will be reciprocated. But even if not, like it's still good enough to try and understand someone who had a different upbringing than you, totally different upbringing than you.
Right.
And I gained a lot of gratitude for her. And
Mm,
like I moved from Louisiana to LA. I moved across the
yeah,
country. She moved across the world.
yeah.
And like I feel like there's a huge gap, cultural gap between Louisiana and LA, but not nearly as much between the
Mm,
US and the Philippines. So
yeah. Mm-hmm.
I've gained a huge sense of gratitude for her and her courage and her strength of character and
Mm-hmm.
strong-minded and strong-hearted. And she had to be able to
Yeah.
immigrate. And
Yeah.
I think that has really improved our relationship. So
Mm.
I think there are certain things that kind of bridge the gap, but I think I can only control my side of the
Yeah,
gap. So for me,
right.
that's what it's meant. Yeah,
Mhm.
she's definitely like a hero of mine. How could she not?
Because of her leaving her home.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Anna, any closing thoughts? Anything else you want to share? Did we miss anything from our pre-interview that you want to say?
Just thinking about going back to my experience and then also you sharing your experience, thinking about like living in this country, and then gaining opportunities, but then also like it comes with other factors, that sometimes we can't we can't control, right? And so then I think for me, as I'm thinking about working with young adults and helping them navigate through their 20s, one thing that I learned from the research that we're doing is that the difference between young adults and adults is that young adults are experiencing, for example, responsibility for the first time. They're experiencing career for the first time. They're experiencing like different relationships for the first time. They're experiencing so many things for the first time. And so then in this moment, I can see how lost they might feel or how like also hopeful because like, oh, I'm an adult now, I can do all these things. As I'm thinking about young adults and their experience, just to let them know that they are not alone. They're not alone. If they have other friends who are in their same age, talk about your experiences, because if you open to them and talk to them, like you will find out that there's so many similarities in what they're going through, and sometimes we feel like we need to go through this on our own, you know that we're alone and there's no one that might understand us, but there is. And so as a young adult is transitioning and going through relationships experiences, going through like leaving home, going to college, all of this, that there's always grief in there, grief of leaving your high school friends and now departing to a college and now trying to find new friends. There's a grief of like, my parents used to take care of the bills and they used to pay for these things. Now it's my turn to start earning money and pay for my own bills. In this transition, there's so much grief going on. And so then just thinking about young adults and the compassion, to feel compassion towards themselves about, man, you're going through so much. And just
Yeah.
thinking about second generation, first generation, 1.5 generation emerging adults, like different factors are added. But then to maybe go back to their faith, try to see like, how can my faith help me?
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for your insights and for your sharing, especially of your own experiences and what you're learning at Fuller. And I hope to see you soon here at the Newman Center.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Krista, for the time that you gave me to just share.
Appreciate you.